Imagine you were walking through the center of um, a very old, very famous European city, like, Paris or Cologne or something.
Right, yeah, someone with those massive stone streets.
Exactly. And you're standing right in front of this magnificent, sweeping Gothic cathedral. The architecture just looks so deliberate, right? It looks cohesive.
Like it was all planned out perfectly from day one.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's just this one singular vision of stone and glass reaching up into the sky. But if you were to somehow take a structural X-ray of that building, you wouldn't see a single unified creation at all.
No, not even close. You'd see all the hidden layers.
You really would. You'd see that the foundational basement is, it's actually the ruined hypocaust of a Roman bathhouse.
Right, with the underfloor heating and everything.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the altar. The altar is probably sitting squarely on top of an ancient, weathered Celtic standing stone, and those exquisite stained glass windows that everyone takes pictures of.
Those were definitely paid for by, like, early modern merchant capitalists.
100%. Guys who were just desperate to show off their new maritime wealth, right? And then, the sleek, minimalist plaza out front was probably poured just a few years ago to accommodate the endless flow of global tourists.
It's a complete architectural Frankenstein, but it just looks so seamless.
It really does. And I think, well, when we look at Western Europe today, we have this overwhelming tendency to just see the cathedral. We just see this neat, finished concept of, national identities, ancient borders, unbroken lineages.
Which is a very modern illusion, honestly. Yeah.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to take a massive stack of historical, sociological, and demographic sources, when we're looking at everything here, and extract the absolute most crucial aha moments for you.
Yeah, we want to make you the most well-informed person in the room without all the dense academic overload.
Right. We are pointing our lens at the sweeping, messy, and just incredibly layered history of Western Europe. We're tracing this region all the way from the Paleolithic Ice Age right up to hard population data from literally 2025.
It's a massive timeline, but it's all connected.
It is. And our core goal here, the mission of this deep dive, is to completely deconstruct that myth of ancient, pure European identities. We're going to explore how Western Europe actually became a global powerhouse. And spoiler alert, it wasn't through peaceful isolation or pure bloodline.
No, definitely not. It was through relentless fragmentation and constantly layered migration.
And highly productive conflict. Okay,
Yeah.
let's unpack this, because before we can even begin to talk about the grand empires or the castles or the modern nation states, we really have to look at the physical board game they were playing on.
Oh, absolutely. You really cannot understand the history of this region without first looking at the dirt, the water, and the mountains.
The actual literal ground.
Yeah, because in Western Europe, geography is destiny. And the defining characteristic of this geography is that it entirely lacks a single, massive, isolating feature.
Right, there's no one thing that would allow one centralized group to just dominate everyone else.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at ancient Egypt, you have the Nile River, right? It is a single, brilliant lifeline, but it's surrounded by lethal desert.
Which naturally fosters this highly centralized, singular empire. Like, if you control the river.
You control the universe, exactly. Western Europe is the exact opposite of that. It is this dense, tangled, fractured web.
Yeah, I was looking at the topographical maps from the source material, and it's just striking. It's a landscape that seems perfectly calibrated to be, like, just fractured enough to keep people apart, but connected enough to force them to constantly deal with each other.
That's a great way to put it. You have these incredibly navigable rivers.
The Rhine, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, the Danube.
Right, all of them. And then you have coastlines that are heavily indented, meaning natural deep water harbors are literally everywhere.
But then you also have these mountain barriers, right? The Alps, the Pyrenees. They're hard to cross, but they aren't impossible to cross.
And what's fascinating here is that hard but not impossible dynamic is basically the engine of European history. Because the soil was fertile, especially in places like the North European plain, and the rainfall was generally reliable, the environment really favored dense river valley settlements.
So you didn't need these massive state-run irrigation projects just to survive.
Exactly, which meant you didn't need an absolute dictator to manage the water supply.
Oh, wow, that's such a good point.
Yeah, but because of those rivers and the relatively close coastlines, those local settlements couldn't just hide from the world either. Maritime and river trade was simply too practical, too lucrative to ignore.
So this geographic blueprint basically prevented any single imperial center from holding total control over the entire continent for very long.
Right. It forced a pattern where you had highly distinct, localized cultures that were inextricably linked by sea lanes and river corridors.
But wait, if the geography naturally created these distinct localized pockets, why wouldn't people just stay put? Like, why not just fortify your little valley in the Alps or your stretch of the Seine and ignore everyone else?
Because of resource distribution. No single pocket had everything it needed. If you had great timber, you might lack tin.
Or if you had agricultural surplus, you might need salt to preserve it, right?
Exactly. The geography forced an economic codependence. And that reliance on movement brings us to the earliest human settlements, where we see that the myth of a pure original native European is basically a complete fabrication.
It's just not supported by the data at
No,
all.
no. When we look at the archaeological record, starting with anatomically modern humans arriving in the Upper Paleolithic, it is a story of constant churning. But the real paradigm shift is the Neolithic Revolution.
Yes. Okay, this is where we get to a term for the sources that gets thrown around a lot in archaeology, the LBK horizon. It sounds incredibly technical, but it's actually describing a massive fundamental shift in human daily life.
Right. It really is. LBK stands for linear band ceramic, or linear pottery culture.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Right. But it basically refers to early farming populations that originated in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they began moving into Central and Western Europe around the 6th millennium BCE.
And the name comes from the distinctive lines they carved into their ceramics, right?
Yeah, but the pottery is just a marker. It's a marker for an entirely new operating system. They brought domesticated crops, sheep, goats, and a sedentary lifestyle. They were building these massive timber longhouses. But here is the critical point. They did not walk into an empty continent.
Right. They ran into the indigenous hunter-gatherers who had been tracking reindeer and foraging in those forests since the glaciers retreated. So what happens? Does it just play out like a violent conquest where the farmers wipe out the foragers?
It's far more complex than a simple eradication. The genetic and archaeological evidence reveals a deeply messy period of interaction.
Messy how? Like fighting or trading?
Both, really. In some areas, the foragers retreated to the less arable highlands or the coasts. In others, they traded with the farmers. But over centuries, what we actually see is a slow, undeniable genetic and cultural blending.
So the farming societies and the foraging societies intermarried.
Yes, they intermarried, they adopted technologies from one another, and by the time we reach the Bronze Age, we see phenomena like the bell beaker culture.
I really want to dig into that because the bell beaker culture is such a wild concept to me. You're talking about a period roughly 4,500 years ago, and suddenly you see this very specific type of inverted bell-shaped drinking cup showing up in graves everywhere.
Everywhere, from Spain to Scotland to Central Europe.
Yeah? Like, how does a cup become a transnational trend?
Well, it wasn't just a cup. The bell beaker represents a transnational package of prestige and technology. It included copper daggers, archery wrist guards, and very specific burial customs.
So it was a whole aesthetic, a status symbol.
Exactly. It signifies the emergence of a new warrior elite class that was connected across vast distances through metal trading. It proves that even in the deepest mists of prehistory, Western Europe was formed by overlapping networks. It was wave after wave of newcomers integrating with, overlapping, and transforming earlier populations.
You know, it makes me think of Western Europe's geography like a giant, inescapable networking event. Like, imagine you go to a conference in a massive, sprawling hotel.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, so you have your own private table in a corner alcove, maybe that represents a mountain valley, or an island like Britain. You can retreat there and have your own distinct local culture. But the rivers and the coastlines, those act like the main hallways of the hotel.
The corridors of movement.
Yes, if you want resources, if you want to get to the buffet, you have to walk down those hallways. And because the hallways are narrow and crowded, you're constantly forced to bump into your neighbors. Sometimes you trade business cards with them, and sometimes you get into a fistfight by the elevator. But you are never truly isolated.
I like the spatial reality of that analogy, but we really need to push it further. It's not just that they are bumping into each other in the hallway. It's that the people in one alcove are realizing they can't even build a proper table without the wood from the alcove across the hall.
The economic codependence again.
Exactly. That constant interaction sets something very deep in the region's cultural DNA. It created a civilization that fundamentally thrives on contact, on friction, and on the constant recombination of ideas rather than on isolation.
Right. But while this geography created a vibrant patchwork of tribal mosaics, like the Celtic groups in Gaul, the Germanic tribes further north, it kind of hit a ceiling, didn't it?
It did. A patchwork of kinship networks, warrior aristocracies, and local polytheistic religions can facilitate trade, sure, but it struggles to build large-scale unified infrastructure.
So, to move to the next level of complexity, they needed an external shock.
And that shock was Rome.
Rome comes crashing in and lays down the absolute foundation for what we consider a state. They don't just bring armies, right? They bring a universal operating system.
A completely new way of organizing society.
Yeah, like taxation, written administration, monumental stone architecture, Latin law, and eventually the infrastructure of Christianity. But what strikes me is that Rome didn't erase the local cultures. I mean, they didn't have the manpower to replace everyone.
No, they didn't at all. They just layered their system right on top of the existing Celtic and Iberian identities.
That's wild, just building right over it.
That's the essence of Romanization in the West. You get Gallo-Romans in France or Romanized Britons. They might still worship a local water deity, for instance.
But now they build a Roman-style bathhouse over the spring and carve the deity's name in Latin.
Exactly. Rome provided the legal and infrastructural skeleton that unified these incredibly diverse peoples. But, as we know, the western half of the Roman Empire eventually disintegrates.
Right. The administration stops paying the army, the tax networks break down, and the central authority just collapses. Which brings us to the migration period, roughly 400 to 1000 CE.
Right.
And this is the era that pop culture loves to dismiss as the Dark Ages. It's painted as this catastrophic tragedy where everyone suddenly forgot how to read, the aqueducts stopped working, and society devolved into muddy anarchy for 500 years.
And the term Dark Ages is incredibly misleading.
Really? How so?
Well, yes, there was a dramatic loss of material complexity. The long-distance trade in cheap, high-quality ceramics and roof tiles basically collapsed.
So standard of living did drop.
Materially, yes. But politically and culturally, it wasn't a void at all. It was a period of intense, localized reorganization. Various Germanic-speaking groups, the Franks, the Goths, the Anglo-Saxons, the Lombards, they migrated into the power vacuum left by Rome.
And here is where we get to the central thesis for understanding everything that comes next. The source material makes it clear that the defining lens of Western Europe isn't the Roman Empire at its peak.
No, it's not.
It is the Frankish-Latin Christian synthesis that occurred during this supposedly dark time. I really want to slow down to pull this apart because it feels like the absolute hinge of Western history. Who were the Franks, and why are they the specific group that ends up writing the cultural source code for Europe?
Okay, so the Franks were originally a confederation of Germanic tribes from the Lower Rhine region who gradually expanded into Roman Gaul. And what made the Franks uniquely successful was that they didn't just conquer and destroy the Romanized population.
You fused with it.
Exactly, they fused. This synthesis is the merger point of three distinct elements. First, you have the Roman inheritance, the concept of written law, bureaucratic administration, and the lingering prestige of the empire.
Okay, that's why.
Second, you have the Germanic warrior politics, a system based on personal loyalty, martial honor, and the distribution of plunder.
Right, the guy with the biggest sword gets the loot.
Basically. And third, you have Catholic Christianity, which provided moral authority, a network of literate administrators, and a universal worldview.
And the ultimate poster child for this is the Frankish king Clovis, right?
Yeah.
Right, in the late 5th century. Because Clovis does something incredibly pragmatic. He conquers this vast territory, but he realizes that ruling millions of Gallo-Romans with a minority of Frankish warriors is unstable.
Highly unstable.
So he converts to Catholic Christianity. He doesn't just rule by the sword. He perfectly aligns his Frankish military power with the clerical power of the church and the existing Romanized population.
It was a masterstroke of political fusion. By converting to Catholicism rather than Arianism, which many other Germanic tribes had adopted, Clovis gained the immediate backing of the powerful Gallo-Roman bishops.
Oh, that's smart.
He basically established a paradigm.
How?
The king has the armies, but the church provides the ideological legitimacy to use them. It turns raw conquest into divine right. And later, the Carolingian dynasty, particularly under Charlemagne, takes this fusion and scales it up into a massive civilizational project.
Right. Charlemagne manages to temporarily reassemble much of the West under one Christian imperial frame. But from what we're looking at in the sources, the true genius of the Carolingian era wasn't just the sheer size of the empire.
No, the size was actually quite brittle.
Right, the genius was how war, politics, and religion literally fused into a highly durable, self-sustaining social order. It was the birth of what we loosely call feudalism.
Yeah, let's look at the actual mechanics of that system because it defines everyday life for centuries.
Yeah.
You have a society operating without a massive coin-based Roman economy, right?
Because the trade routes had broken down.
Exactly. So land becomes the primary currency. The ruler grants land to a warrior aristocracy. In exchange, those warriors provide military service and local administration. The warriors extract labor and agricultural surplus from the peasantry tied to that land.
The classic lords and peasants dynamic.
Right. But then the rulers and the elites partner with the church, granting them massive estates too. In return, the church builds infrastructure, preserves literacy, runs the chancelleries, and most importantly, sanctifies the ruler's power. It is an incredibly tight, closed-loop system of mutual obligation.
And it completely reorganizes the rhythm of human existence.
Yeah.
When you look at how a peasant or a noble actually lived during this time, every single action is dictated by this Frankish-Christian operating system.
Oh, absolutely. Everything from warfare to dinner.
Elite culture becomes entirely built around gift exchange, martial honor, and heavy cavalry warfare.
Yeah.
But even the diet of a commoner changes. Like, the Christian calendar introduced strict fasting rules,
Yeah.
dictating that meat couldn't be eaten on Fridays or during Lent.
And that dietary restriction is a perfect example of how religious ideology literally shapes the physical economy. Because you couldn't eat meat for roughly a third of the year, there was a massive artificial demand for fish.
Which is crazy to think about. Religion driving an entire fishing industry.
It did.
Yeah.
It directly spurred the development of maritime fishing economies, shipbuilding, and salt networks to preserve the catch. Conversely, feast days meant the slaughter of pigs and the mass consumption of ale or wine.
So monasteries basically became the primary centers of agricultural innovation.
Brewing, viticulture, you name it. The church even standardized musical notation for Gregorian chants, which basically became the root of all Western art music.
That's unbelievable. The echoes of this synthesis are just everywhere. And when Charlemagne's grandsons eventually fought over his empire, they signed the Treaty of Verdun in 843.
Right, partitioning the empire.
Yeah, they partitioned the territory into 3 chunks: a Western kingdom, an Eastern kingdom, and a middle strip. And when you look at a map of that partition, you're basically looking at the rough borders of modern France, modern Germany, and the heavily contested borderlands.
Places like Alsace-Lorraine.
Exactly. Places that they would fight over all the way into the 20th century. The geopolitical fault lines of World War I were being drawn in the 9th century.
It really highlights how deeply these historical layers dictate the future. But we also have to acknowledge the immense cultural footprint this era left behind.
Oh, the pop culture aspect is undeniable. Think about it. Almost every piece of modern fantasy media, whether you are playing a massive open-world video game, watching a dragon show on streaming, or reading high fantasy novels, is essentially a highly stylized, romanticized version of this specific Frankish-Latin era.
The stone castles, the armored knights.
The monks hunched over illuminated manuscripts, the holy relics, the complex feudal loyalties. We use this specific historical remix as the default mythology of the Western world because it is the foundational layer of our modern institutional memory.
It's the aesthetic we default to for fantasy, but here is the critical turning point in the timeline. That Carolingian Empire, that brief moment of centralized unity under Charlemagne, it fractures. The Middle Kingdom dissolves, the kings lose their absolute grip, and Western Europe finds itself in a very precarious position. Without a single Roman emperor, or a single dominant Frankish king to keep the peace, how does the region stay connected?
How does it avoid collapsing completely back into isolated warring microstates?
Exactly.
And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. They didn't try to build another megastate. The physical geography and the deeply entrenched local lords made that basically impossible.
Right, you couldn't just conquer everybody.
Instead, they built transnational institutions. And the absolute powerhouse among these was the medieval church. Our sources point out that sociologists often compare the function of the medieval church to the original internet.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is an incredibly precise analogy. You just have to look past the technology and focus on the structural function. What does the internet do?
It coordinates information, standardizes communication protocols.
Right, and it connects vast distances across entirely different physical jurisdictions. The medieval church functioned as that overarching network. It preserved literacy in a standardized universal code,
Latin.
Latin. That meant a scholar in a monastery in damp, isolated Ireland could write a theological or legal text that could be perfectly read, debated, and applied by a bishop in sun-drenched Italy or a royal clerk in Paris.
Wow. So the monasteries are basically the servers,
Yes.
and the network is connected through pilgrimage routes, the exchange of holy relics, and a universal system of canon law. So even if the Prince of Region A is currently engaged in a brutal territorial war with the Duke of Region B, the clerics in both regions are still operating on the same mainframe.
They're still sharing the same data packets, exactly.
But this creates a massive defining tension.
Yeah.
You have the state, the kings, the dukes, the guys with the swords and the armies, and you have the church, the popes, the bishops, the guys with the books, the administrative skills, and the keys to eternal salvation.
And neither side can completely eradicate the other. That's the key.
Right. A king might command the army, but he cannot anoint himself. He needs the church's spiritual legitimacy.
And the Pope holds immense spiritual and diplomatic power, but he has very limited direct military force. He relies on secular kings for physical protection. This is the great duality of Western Europe, church versus state, and subsequently local power versus central power.
Because power was inherently split, no single ruler could achieve the kind of absolute totalitarian control you might see in other global empires of the same era.
Never. There was always a check on their power.
I really want to explore how this tension actually played out on the ground. Because if a king became too tyrannical or tried to extract too much wealth, he couldn't just crush everyone. The local nobles could appeal to the Pope to excommunicate the king, right?
Which essentially gave them religious permission to rebel. It was the ultimate trump card.
Or later on, the growing merchant towns could leverage their financial wealth to buy charters of independence from caste-strapped monarchs. It forced the creation of systems that did not rely on the personal whim of one guy at the top.
Precisely. It necessitated the rise of impersonal institutions. When power is a constant negotiation between competing factions, you have to create legal and bureaucratic frameworks to mediate that friction.
You know, this really reminds me of the transition from a scrappy startup to a mature corporate structure.
Oh, how so?
Well, in a startup, you have that one visionary, highly charismatic, sometimes volatile CEO. If that CEO gets hit by a bus, the whole company crashes because everything was based on their personal relationships and sheer force of will. That's what an absolute emperor or a warlord is.
Right, a single point of failure.
Exactly. But what Western Europe did was realize they couldn't rely on the CEO. So they built middle management, human resources, and legal departments.
Okay, I would push back slightly on middle management, only because it implies they were subservient to the CEO. What they built were entirely parallel power structures.
Ah, I see.
They built guilds to regulate trade and labor, independent of the local lord. They built universities, which were originally just guilds of students and masters, to standardize knowledge and issue credentials that were respected across borders.
They developed complex, overlapping legal systems, too.
Yeah, canon law for the church, common law or civil law for the state, and merchant law for commerce. Eventually, you get parliaments, estates general, and corporate bodies. They built systems so that the machinery of society continued to function and even expand, regardless of who was wearing the crown or whether the king was entirely incompetent.
That shift from power resting entirely in the physical body of a person to power resting in an abstract institution is arguably one of Western Europe's most profound mechanics. It means the legal courts keep hearing cases even if the monarch is on their deathbed.
Exactly. The institution survives the individual.
But this brings up a really interesting psychological problem. If you are a ruler in this highly institutionalized, deeply fractured environment, you can't just rely on brute force to get your way. An institution, a wealthy city, or a rival lord can always challenge you. So how do you actually dominate?
Well, if you cannot reliably compel obedience through physical violence, you have to make your power highly visible and incredibly persuasive. You have to make your rivals actually want to emulate you.
You shift the theater of power from the battlefield to the court.
Precisely.
And this leads us to one of the most fascinating sociological frameworks we encountered in the sources. It's called the Liz subpersonality lens. I want to break this down because the name sounds a bit strange at first.
It does, but it's remarkably accurate.
Yeah, so the Liz archetype represents a specific kind of socialization, often associated with high-status, charismatic figures. Historically, it basically mimics the covert power dynamics often observed in elite female social circles, where overt physical aggression is heavily penalized.
Right. You can't just attack someone physically without losing your status.
Right, so instead of punching someone in the face to assert dominance, you rule through social exclusion, reputation destruction, aesthetic superiority, and calculated charm. So what does this all mean? It means they put on lipstick before going to war and then wrote a constitution about it afterward.
It is a brilliant sociological tool for understanding the evolution of European statecraft. The Liz lens views Western Europe as a civilization that absolutely perfected power as a performance.
Power as prestige.
Yes, it highlights how the region excels at disguising the bare, bloody teeth of raw power beneath layers of elegant institutions, refined etiquette, and eventually the language of human rights and democratic consensus.
You don't just conquer someone. You dictate the fashion. You dictate the diplomatic protocols. You dictate the architecture and the art. And you do it with such overwhelming cultural confidence that your rivals, and even the people you have actively subjugated, start calling your specific tastes and your specific rules civilization.
If they want to be taken seriously, they have to play your game by your rules.
And we see the ultimate physical manifestation of this in something like the Palace of Versailles under King Louis XIV of France.
Oh, Versailles is the textbook example. Louis had experienced severe aristocratic rebellions when he was a child. He knew that the traditional nobles, out in their provincial castles with their own private armies, were a lethal threat.
But he couldn't just execute all of them.
No, that would spark a massive civil war. So what did he do?
He builds the most ridiculously opulent, mesmerizing palace the world has ever seen, and he makes it the absolute center of the universe. He essentially tells nobility, if you want access to power, wealth, or royal favor, you have to come live here with me.
He takes these rugged, dangerous warlords and turns them into courtiers.
He forces them to spend their fortunes on impossibly expensive clothes just to keep up with court fashion. He creates a system where adult men, seasoned warriors, are bitterly arguing over who gets the prestigious honor of holding the king's candlestick when he goes to bed.
It's incredible. He bankrupted their independence through aesthetics. He turned a military threat into a captive audience in his own carefully choreographed reality show.
A reality show. That's exactly what it was.
And that performance culture runs incredibly deep throughout European history, evolving to fit whatever the era demands. It transitions from the courtly rituals of Versailles to the self-mythologizing mercantile power of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century.
Where power was about, austere bourgeois wealth and naval supremacy.
Right. And later, it becomes the quiet, bespoke, institutional dominance of 19th century London finance. It's the cosmopolitan soft power of European capitals today. Western Europe learned that if you make your values look universal and your tastes look inevitable, you exert a kind of control that armies alone can never achieve.
It's almost insidious and incredibly effective. You operate within a society entirely built around symbolic capital, credentialing, and soft power. But let's look at the systemic effect of all this. You have this hyper-competitive environment. You have dozens, and eventually hundreds, of rival states, principalities, bishoprics, and city-states tightly packed into this geographic peninsula.
All bumping into each other in those hallways.
Exactly. They are all obsessed with prestige. They are all building up their institutions. They are all trying to culturally and economically outperform each other. The internal friction is astronomical.
And this brings us to one of the central paradoxes of Western European history. In most other historical contexts, severe political fragmentation is a death sentence.
It leads to civilizational collapse, endless civil war, or it makes the region easy prey for conquest by a unified outside empire.
But Western Europe turned fragmentation into a supercharged engine of progress.
Because the fragmentation wasn't just chaos, it was a highly structured, institutionalized competition.
Exactly. Because you had hundreds of competing states, you had an incredible, inescapable driver for military, technological, and economic innovation. I mean, if you look at an imperial monopoly, like Ming or Qing Dynasty China, if the central bureaucracy decides to ban a certain technology...
Like those massive ocean-going exploration fleets.
Right. If the emperor says no more fleets, that technology dies. There is no alternative sponsor. But in Europe, If one state decided to ban a controversial scientific idea or refused to fund a new navigational technology, a rival state right next door would enthusiastically fund it just to gain a competitive advantage.
It's the ultimate high-stakes free market of ideas and warfare. If the King of Portugal turns down Christopher Columbus, he just walks over to the monarchs of Spain.
Exactly. Or if the Pope tries to suppress a new astronomical theory, a Protestant prince in northern Germany will protect the astronomer just to spite the Pope.
And this competitive pressure cooker eventually explodes outward. As the towns and cities make a massive demographic and economic comeback after the early medieval period, you get the rise of early capitalism.
You get a newly empowered merchant class, the bourgeoisie, who possess the immense capital required to fund maritime trade and technological research.
And suddenly, this highly competitive, highly institutionalized local system goes global. This is the pivot to the early modern and industrial eras. The internal pressure of Europe spills over the oceans. The economic gravity of the continent shifts violently from the Mediterranean, which had been the center of the world since Rome, toward the Atlantic ports.
Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, London.
And this global expansion is driven by the exact same mechanics we've been discussing. State-sponsored competition, the ruthless extraction of resources through colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, and massive capital accumulation.
And internally, the Industrial Revolution completely rewrites the social contract. Coal, iron, railways, and mass factory labor transform society at a molecular level.
The peasantry, who had been tied to the agricultural season since the Frankish era, were ripped from the land and transformed into urban industrial workers.
And the old, local, deeply layered identities began to be flattened. Subjects of a crown were slowly, often violently, transformed into citizens of a state.
And here's where we hit the profound tragedy of the modern era. For thousands of years, Western European identity was messy. It was a fluid hybrid of Roman foundations, Germanic tribal customs, local dialects, and Christian universality.
Right. It was always mixing.
But as the industrial states grew more powerful, they needed standardized populations to run the factories and staff the massive conscripted armies. So governments intentionally hardened those fluid identities into rigid mass nationalism.
They utilized the printing press, mandatory state schooling, centralized bureaucracy, and mass media to create strict, exclusionary definitions of what it meant to be French or German or Italian.
They took the natural, localized linguistic spectrum of the continent and drew hard borders through it, suppressing minority dialects and enforcing a single national narrative. I want you to really pause and absorb the irony of this.
It's a dark irony.
It really is. The modern concept of being strictly, purely French or strictly German is, historically speaking, a relatively recent manufactured identity. It's a layer of paint applied in the 18th and 19th centuries over a deeply mixed, spectacularly messy past.
But it worked.
It did. Yet in the 20th century, the people of Europe were willing to wage industrial-scale world wars, devastating entire generations over these newly hardened, heavily policed categories.
The system of competitive states, which had driven so much innovation, escalated into total industrialized warfare. The two world wars, the rise of totalitarian fascism, and the mechanized horrors of the Holocaust were the absolute darkest expressions of that European capacity for institutional efficiency, combined this time with hardened, exclusionary ethnic mythologies.
It shattered the continent's dominance completely.
By 1945, the old model of warring, hyper-competitive nation-states had pushed the region to the absolute brink of annihilation.
They had essentially burned the cathedral to the ground. And the devastation was so total that Western Europe was forced to fundamentally reassemble itself yet again. They couldn't survive another internal war, so they had to pivot.
They shifted away from the hyper-nationalist model and began building institutions of economic and political interdependence,
Which eventually evolved into the European Union.
And in many ways, the European Union is a postmodern attempt to return to the region's ancient roots. It is a return to overlapping networks, transnational legal systems, and layered identities.
It's very similar in function, if not in spirit, to the universal framework the medieval church provided.
Exactly. It is an attempt to institutionalize the friction so that states compete economically in Brussels rather than militarily in the trenches of Flanders.
And that transition brings us directly to the modern tapestry of Western Europe today. And when we look at the contemporary data in our sources, it is clear that the region is undergoing a demographic shift. on a scale perhaps not seen since the migration period that followed the fall of Rome.
It's massive. The modern era has added an entirely new layer of post-colonial and labor migration.
Let's look at the hard data, specifically the Eurostat estimates projecting into 2024 and 2025.
Okay, let's break it down. The numbers clearly illustrate a profound transformation. According to Eurostat, as of January 1st, 2025, an estimated 46.7 million residents within the EU were born outside the EU.
Almost 47 million people.
Right. That constitutes 10.4% of the total EU population. Furthermore, in 2024, nearly 10% of people living in EU countries were non-nationals of the specific country they resided in.
And when we zoom in on specific national censuses, the mechanics of this shift become even more apparent. Let's look at the UK.
A prime example.
Right. In the 2021 census for England and Wales, 81.7% of residents fell into the broad white demographic category. That is a measurable drop from 86% just 10 years prior in 2011.
Which indicates significant ongoing diversification.
Yeah, and it's heavily concentrated in major urban centers. But why is this happening? It's not just random movement.
No, it is driven by specific economic and historical mechanics. First, you have post-imperial migration populations moving from former colonies in South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean to the metropolitan centers of London or Paris.
The empire coming home, basically.
Exactly. Second, as these economies shifted from domestic manufacturing to globalized service and knowledge economies, they actively drew in international labor. Furthermore, Western Europe has a rapidly aging native population.
Right, birth rates have been dropping for decades.
So to sustain their complex post-war welfare states and pension systems, these economies fundamentally require a constant influx of younger, working-age immigrants.
And we see this replicated across the continent. Our sources note that Belgium reported in 2025 that 36% of its population had a foreign background.
Over a third.
Yeah, and the geographic distribution is fascinating. Brussels, the bureaucratic heart of the EU, is dramatically more diverse than the surrounding rural regions of Flanders or Wallonia. It acts as an international hub.
And in France, official statistics show that roughly 1 in 10 residents are immigrants.
And when you factor in the second and third generation descendants, particularly from North Africa, that cultural footprint is massive.
Germany, similarly, reports a huge population with a migration background, initially driven by post-war guest worker programs from Turkey and Southern Europe to rebuild their shattered industry.
And more recently by refugee influxes.
Right. So this raises an important question. How do we conceptualize this new map? The sociological reality we must grapple with is that the modern map of Western Europe is absolutely not a simplistic binary of native peoples versus outsiders.
It's way messier than that.
The data reveals a deeply layered, highly complex field. You have historic ethnic majorities living alongside regional linguistic minorities, centuries-old diasporas, post-war labor migrants, post-colonial communities, internal EU movers from east to west, recent refugees, and increasingly large mixed-origin populations.
This reality creates incredible dynamism. You get cosmopolitan megacities, vibrant, hybrid popular cultures, and massive economic engines. But of course, it also creates immense, unavoidable friction.
Inevitably.
When sociologists analyze the political landscape of Europe right now, it essentially boils down to 4 underlying tensions. And what I find so compelling is that if we look closely at these 4 modern tensions, they're echoing the exact same historical themes we've been tracking for the last hour.
It's all cyclical. Let's break those 4 tensions down. The first is tradition versus progress. You have ancient rural villages and heritage cultures constantly confronting the homogenizing forces of digital globalization, urban sprawl, and progressive social values.
It is the friction between the deep agrarian past and the hyper-connected future.
Exactly. The second tension is unity versus fragmentation. We've seen this struggle since the Roman Empire collapsed. Today, it's the push and pull between the overarching coordination of the European Union, the centralized bureaucracy in Brussels, and the sovereign desires of individual nations to control their own borders, their own budgets, and their own legal destinies.
It's literally the modern version of a local king pushing back against the Pope.
It really is. The third tension is religion versus secularism. Western Europe was profoundly shaped by the Frankish-Christian synthesis, but today it is arguably the most highly secularized region on Earth. Yet, religion remains a massive political flashpoint.
Right. You see this vividly in the debates over minority rights, the presence of religious symbols in public spaces, and the integration of Islam into highly secular liberal norms. And we're not taking sides here, but our sources point out that this friction is incredibly specific depending on the country's historical operating system.
That's a crucial point.
Like in France, for instance, you have the doctrine of laïcité. It's a very strict form of secular republicanism that demands the public sphere be entirely free of religious influence.
Yeah.
That historical model clashes violently at times with the religious pluralism of its newer post-colonial populations who view public religious expression as a fundamental right.
Exactly. It's two completely different frameworks colliding. And finally, the fourth tension is local identity versus globalization. The major port cities, the finance hubs, and the university towns thrive on openness, immigration, and global capital.
But many local communities, particularly in deindustrialized regions, feel profound anxiety about cultural homogenization.
Downward economic mobility, direct labor competition, they feel the ground shifting beneath them.
When you synthesize all of this, the debates over housing shortages, the fierce arguments over who gets to cross borders, how religion fits into public life, the struggle for local control against a centralized bureaucracy, it hits you that none of these debates are actually new.
No, not at all.
They're wearing modern clothes, they are debated on social media rather than in a king's court, but they are the exact same underlying mechanics. It's the same push and pull of localism versus universalism, of fragmentation versus unity that the region has been wrestling with since the 5th century.
That is perhaps the deepest insight the historical record offers us. Western Europe has never been characterized by perfect stability, isolation, or ethnic purity. It is defined by its remarkable capacity to take immense pressure, absorb overlapping layers of migration, endure brutal conflict, and then slowly institutionalize that friction into a new societal order.
Power thrives in competition. Institutions are built to outlast the failures of individuals. And identity is a narrative constructed over thousands of years of constant layering, not something inherited through static, unchanging bloodlines.
That's exactly what the data shows us.
Which brings us back to where we started. Remember that grand cathedral we were standing in front of? The one built on the Roman bathhouse, resting on the Celtic stones, paid for by merchants and surrounded by tourists. The vast history we've unpacked today tells us that a civilization's identity is strongest, not when it is kept isolated under glass, protected from the outside world.
But when it learns how to survive contact.
Yes, when it learns to absorb the pressure of newcomers and continue building upward. So as you look at the headlines coming out of Western Europe today, all the loud, messy anxiety over globalization, migration, the EU, and rapid cultural change, I want to leave you with a different way to view it. In many parts of the world, a frontier is an external place.
A wild geography out on the edge of the map that you conquer.
But in Western Europe, the frontier has always been internal. The frontier is the friction in the cities. It's the clash of layers in the town squares. What if the intense cultural and political battles happening in Europe right now aren't the tragic decline of traditional society?
A really provocative thought.
What if they are simply the chaotic, violent sparks of a civilization doing exactly what it has always done? Encountering the internal frontier, breaking down the old hardened layer and forging the next era. We are just living too close to it to recognize the new architecture being built. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating journey through the layers.
Keep questioning the narratives around you, keep looking for the hidden layers, and we will see you next time.